The New York Times of May 21, 2006, featured estimates of how much revenue the federal government is losing as a result of tax cuts, more than $50 billion over a 5-year period. Meanwhile, a front-page story in the Wall Street Journal reported the government as receiving a surge in unanticipated revenue coming from the rich. There is no contradiction between these two stories. The Times reported estimates, while the Wall Street Journal reported what actually happened. Moreover, there is no real difference in outlook between the writers who wrote these two stories. To the Wall Street Journal writer, the increased tax revenue from the rich was a windfall for the U.S. Treasury. There has long been a difference in outlook between the reporters who write up the news for the Wall Street Journal and those who write the same newspaper's editorial page. If the reporter thinks that the increased revenue to the Treasury was unanticipated, that suggests that she has not been reading the editorial pages of her own newspaper. For years, indeed decades, the Wall Street Journal's editorial page has repeatedly been arguing that cutting tax rates increases tax revenues. Nor did this idea originate with them. There is a whole school of economists who have been saying the same thing even longer. There is nothing unanticipated about the increased revenue. It was unanticipated by the Congressional Budget Office's estimates, but that is why the CBO has come under fire from economists. But apparently none of this has yet registered on the Wall Street Journal's front-page reporter. More than 40 years ago, President John F. Kennedy got Congress to cut tax rates, with the idea that this would provide incentives to change economic behavior in a way that would increase economic growth and individual incomes, and therefore lead to even more tax revenue coming into the Treasury than had been the case under the higher tax rates. That is exactly what happened. Years later, Ronald Reagan made the same argument, and his tax cuts for the rich produced the same result. Tax receipts during every year of the 1980s were higher than they had ever been in any year before. Moreover, taxes paid specifically by the rich were higher than before, because their incomes rose so much as the economy boomed that they paid more total taxes despite the reduced tax rate. How surprised should we be that exactly the same thing has happened after tax cuts under the Bush administration? Apparently very surprised if we were front-page reporters for the Wall Street Journal. Given the steeply progressive tax rates, most of the taxes paid are paid by people in income brackets that liberals choose to call the rich, though that label would probably come as some surprise to many people in those brackets. Therefore, any serious reductions in tax rates will necessarily directly affect them most. The point, however, is not simply to move money around, but to change behavior in a way that will result in more economic activity. Tax cuts have a long track record of doing that, resulting in rising national incomes and rising employment. But there is no way that some people are ever going to admit that what they call tax cuts for the rich are tax cuts for the economy. As far as they are concerned, this is all just an excuse to give something to the rich, in hopes that it will trickle down to the lower income brackets. A year ago, this column defied anyone to quote any economist, in government, academia, or anywhere else outside an insane asylum, who had ever argued in favor of such a trickle-down theory. Many people quoted David Stockman as saying that others had made that argument, but David Stockman was not even among the first 1,000 people to make that claim. What is crucial is that not one of those who made the claim could provide a single quote from anybody who had advocated a trickle-down theory. The trickle-down theory has been a stock phrase on the left for decades, and yet not one of those who denounce it can find anybody who advocated it. The tenacity with which they cling to these catchwords shows how desperately they need them, if only to safeguard their vision of the world and of themselves. Anyone who follows the media has probably heard many times that the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and incomes of the population in general are stagnating. Moreover, those who say such things can produce many statistics, including data from the Census Bureau, which seem to indicate that. On the other hand, income tax data recently released by the Internal Revenue Service seem to show the exact opposite. People in the bottom fifth of income tax filers in 1996 had their incomes increase by 91% by 2005. The top 1%, the rich, who are supposed to be monopolizing the money, according to the left, saw their incomes decline by a whopping 26%. Meanwhile, the average taxpayer's real income increased by 24% between 1996 and 2005. How can all this be? How can official statistics from different agencies of the same government, the Census Bureau and the IRS, lead to such radically different conclusions? There are wild cards in such data that need to be kept in mind when you hear income statistics thrown around, especially when they are thrown around by people who are trying to prove something for political purposes. One of these wild cards is that most Americans do not stay in the same income brackets throughout their lives. Millions of people move from one bracket to another in just a few years. What that means statistically is that comparing the top income bracket with the bottom income bracket over a period of years tells you nothing about what is happening to the actual flesh and blood human beings who are moving between brackets during those years. That is why the IRS data, which are for people 25 years old and older, and which follow the same individuals over time, find those in the bottom 20% of income tax filers almost doubling their income in a decade. That is why they are no longer in the same bracket. That is also why the share of income going to the bottom 20% bracket can be going down, as the Census Bureau data show, while the income going to the people who began the decade in that bracket is going up by large amounts. Unfortunately, most income statistics, including those from the Census Bureau, do not follow individuals over time. The Internal Revenue Service does that, and so does a study at the University of Michigan, but they are the exceptions rather than the rule. Following trends among income brackets over the years creates the illusion of following people over time, but the only way to follow people is to follow people. Another wild card in income statistics is that many such statistics are about households or families whose sizes vary over time, vary between one racial or ethnic group and another, and vary between one income bracket and another. That is why household or family income can remain virtually unchanged for decades, while per capita income is going up by very large amounts. The number of people per household and per family is declining. Differences in the number of people per household from one ethnic group to another is why Hispanics have higher household incomes than blacks, while blacks have higher individual incomes than Hispanics. Considering the millions of dollars being paid to each of the anchors who broadcast network news, surely these networks can afford to hire a few statisticians to check the statistics being thrown around before these numbers are broadcast across the land as facts on which we are supposed to base policies and elect presidents. Now that the Internal Revenue Service data show the opposite of what the media and the politicians have been saying for years, should we expect either to change? Not bloody likely. The University of Michigan study, which has been going on for decades, shows patterns very similar to those of the IRS data. Those patterns have been ignored for decades. Too many in the media and in politics choose whatever statistics fit their preconceptions.
Thank you for watching that. Another interesting quote from Thomas Sowell. The Obama administration seems to be following what might be called the Detroit pattern, increasing taxes, harassing businesses, and pandering to unions. In the short run, it got mayors re-elected. In the long run, it reduced Detroit from a thriving city to an economic disaster area whose population was cut in half as its most productive citizens fled. When you think about it, even though trickle-down is not a thing, it's amazing how much the people who really sacrifice, rise from nothing, work extremely hard to create even a small business that employs even just 2, 3, 4, 5 people, giving them the opportunity to earn an income, are taken for granted. If it were so easy, why don't the complainers do it? And of course, everyone who is taken for granted leaves. Let me know what you think about this in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching. Please, if you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you're new to the channel, and until the next video, stay free.